For some time now, there have been rumors that Poland is preparing to send peacekeepers into western Ukraine as a part of what is essentially a land grab. The idea is that this territory in western Ukraine has historically been a part of Poland. There used to be a lot of ethnic Polish people in this area, and therefore Poland has some claim to this territory. Rather than having all of this territory be under Russian control, it would instead come under NATO control, under the control of the Western powers, via a Polish invasion and later annexation. Anyways, up until recently, all of these have been wild rumors. There has been no credible source for any of this intelligence. There has been no solid evidence that this is going to be the case. However, very recently, these rumors have been backed up by the statement of the head of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service, which is known as the SVR. The head of the SVR, a man named Sergei Naryshkin, has pretty much made all of these claims that Poland is preparing to send peacekeepers into the west of Ukraine as part of a land grab. The premise for this land grab is allegedly going to be to protect the region and its peoples from Russian aggression, while in fact, Polish forces, which are supposed to enter this region without the backing of NATO, meaning that they won't have NATO coming to their defense if Russia does anything. Therefore, these Polish forces are actually going to try to stay as far away as possible from any Russian forces. So this is the situation as it is being presented by the head of Russia's Foreign Intelligence Service. The fact that Poland is due to conduct military exercises in the eastern parts of its country is also being claimed as an indicator of an imminent Polish invasion of Ukraine. Although here is where I would like to mention a very important piece of information. These military exercises are in fact not only being conducted in Poland itself, they are also being conducted in the Baltics and in Romania, and they aren't just Polish military exercises, they are joint NATO military exercises. So this is the situation as it is being presented in alternative media. Mainstream media, of course, isn't talking about this at all. I want to give my own thoughts on this subject. The first thing that needs to be said is that Russia is not an impartial party to this war. In fact, there is basically no impartial party to this war among anybody, any of the governments, any of the states and politicians who are consistently talking about it. So whenever we listen to anybody's report of any politician, of any intelligence service, we always need to keep in mind the fact that there is some bias behind their statements. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're lying, it doesn't mean that they're not telling the truth, but it often means that they're not telling the whole truth, even if they indeed see the whole truth. So with this in mind, before we go any further, I first want to make one thing very clear. What I'm about to say is largely just speculation on my part. As of right now, there are a million ways in which this war can evolve. The scenario that I would now like to touch upon is, in my opinion, merely slightly more likely than the rest. I do not think that the Polish military is going to enter the west of Ukraine by itself. I think that if such an operation does happen, which, knowing the confrontationist and warlike political atmosphere in the collective West, is frankly rather likely. I think that it is very likely that there will be some attempt to somehow intervene in this war or to expand it to some other territories. And specifically in the case of Ukraine and Poland, Poland will not be entering the west of Ukraine alone. It will do so with the backing of NATO. And here is why I think that this is the case. The first thing that needs to be understood about the Polish military is that it is not some sort of European giant. It is not one of Europe's great militaries. Today's Polish armed forces only have about 100,000 active duty personnel. This is about a third of what Ukraine had prior to February 24th. Poland's military budget stands at only about 2% of its GDP, and this coming from a country which spends a lot of money maintaining US military bases on its soil, and also has practically no domestic military industrial complex, means that Poland isn't getting a lot of bang for its buck, and it doesn't have that many bucks to spend on its military either. Poland's air defenses are basically non-existent. They are a level below of what Ukraine had before February 24th, meaning that if Polish troops decide to enter Ukraine, then the Russian military would be able to just take potshots at them using all kinds of long-range missiles, and there would be very little that Polish forces would be able to do about it. Polish military personnel at that point would be dying, which would not be a good look either internationally or back home in Poland. That is to say, due to the sheer number of Polish forces which would be entering the west of Ukraine, Russian missile strikes won't put a stop to the operation, but they will inflict losses on the Polish military, and the Polish military won't be able to do anything about it. The fact that the Polish military will, at that point, not even be able to fire a single bullet back at Russian forces is going to look really ugly. In terms of artillery, tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, and things of that nature, the Polish military is also rather lackluster. Poland's best tanks are the Leopard 2A4s and Leopard 2A5s, which are roughly equivalent to those that have been destroyed in northern Syria during Turkey's military operations in that area. The rest of Poland's tanks are essentially Soviet tanks, and we are not talking about the newest, best tanks that the Soviet Union had in the 1980s. We are talking about tanks which are a little bit older than that. Needless to say, given the enormous amounts of modern anti-tank weapons that were so generously delivered to Ukraine, these tanks are not going to last long if there is any kind of fighting, if there is any kind of insurgency in the west of Ukraine. Now, the reason that I'm mentioning all of this is twofold. First of all, if this military ever comes in direct contact with the Russian military, it would not end well for the Polish military. At that point, you would have a Russian military which would control most of Ukraine, consisting of battle-hardened soldiers and experienced commanders, going up against a much smaller and a much weaker Polish military, a military that is smaller and weaker than even the Ukrainian military was, and is essentially completely green and inexperienced. And furthermore, I would have to question Poland's ability to quickly take the western part of Ukraine, even if there aren't any Russian soldiers anywhere near that area. The problem is that there is a lot of bad blood between Ukraine and Poland. After all, both sides remember what happened during the Second World War. Both sides remember the massacres in Galicia and in Volhynia. And the Ukrainian people in this area, which, by the way, is renowned as the most fiercely nationalist part of all of Ukraine, the people in this area are not going to be happy if Polish soldiers enter their country and start setting up their own government, presumably, almost certainly in fact, would start pursuing people who support far-right organizations such as Right Sector, Azov, and would try to bring them to justice. That is almost certainly going to cause a lot of friction between Ukrainians and the Polish military, and that is almost certainly going to evolve into some kind of fighting, some kind of a war between whatever is left of Ukraine at that point and Poland. And depending on exactly how much of Ukraine is left by then, that fighting could be rather severe fighting in which Poland could potentially get bogged down. But furthermore, there is the fact that such an intervention, which really is a blatant land grab no matter how you look at it, is going to be very difficult to package before the rest of the world and even before the people of Western Ukraine if Poland decides to intervene by itself. However, if it's not just Poland intervening, if it is instead, say, 24 NATO countries intervening, then all of these problems that I have described would either be somehow mitigated or would completely go away. A joint NATO task force would, at least in theory, have some ability to stand up to the Russian forces should there be some kind of fighting with Russia. And this is a very important topic that I will get back to in a few minutes. But on top of this, there is the fact that the likelihood of any Ukrainian insurgency or Ukrainian resistance against a joint NATO task force would not only be much lower, but if such resistance ever takes place nonetheless, it would be relatively easily subdued. And I should point out here that this will be the case even if this joint NATO task force is only nominally so. That is to say that even if 70, 80, or even 90% of this joint NATO task force consists of the Polish military and Polish military personnel, while the other 10% come from countries such as Romania, Bulgaria, and so on, but the whole thing is packaged as a joint NATO military operation. That is to say, the whole military operation is presented to the public as something that every NATO member state supports. That is still going to have a huge effect, both legally, since at that point, if Russia does clash with these forces, NATO would be able to invoke Article 5, and also in terms of the image of the whole operation, that is to say, how it is perceived and accepted by the world at large and especially by the people of Western Ukraine. At that point, the setting up of a pro-Polish government and the preparation for the annexation of these territories into Poland, if Poland does decide to go through with this, is all going to be done under the cover of being a joint NATO operation. So for all of these reasons, it seems that the collective West is most likely going to go through with a joint NATO intervention into the west of Ukraine, rather than just having the Polish military conduct a land grab. Now, earlier I mentioned the fact that a joint NATO task force, assuming that it is a de facto joint NATO task force and not just a nominally one, would be able to stand up to the Russian military a lot better than the Polish military can by itself. At least, that is what I am sure the various politicians in the collective West believe. However, it doesn't take a genius to realize that this situation is extremely dangerous. After all, one has to think, what happens if there is some sort of armed clash between these NATO forces and the Russian military? The preconditions for such a clash definitely exist. I don't think that NATO would limit itself to some tiny sliver of land in western Ukraine. Knowing the neocon politicians in the United States and the staunch neoliberals in the European Union, all of whom basically have no reverse gear and vainly believe that taking the maximum hardline position on any matter, taking the most confrontationist position, seeking an outright war, is going to lead them to victory. After all, the daily defeats and retreats that are being experienced by the Ukrainian army is now being universally accepted as a clear sign that Ukraine isn't winning this war, no matter how many weapon systems are delivered to Ukraine, no matter how much intelligence sharing there is between Ukrainian forces and NATO, no matter how many Ukrainian soldiers are trained in Western countries and then shipped back to Ukraine to fight the Russian army, Ukraine won't win this war. Without a full-on NATO military intervention, Ukraine is going to be annihilated. This is something that I have been saying for a while, but slowly and surely, this is also becoming understood by the political class in the West. And that is why the only solution that these neocons and neoliberals who have no reverse gear can possibly see is to escalate this war further by bringing in a full-on NATO military intervention. With these types of politicians running the show in the West, I can easily see such a situation spiraling out of control. I can easily see there being some sort of armed clash between the Russian forces and the NATO forces which are deployed in that area. And at that point, if such a war is limited to conventional arms, there would be no guarantee that the NATO militaries would prevail. And I say this because this is the consequence of the simple fact that NATO is not well equipped to fight this particular war. This war is taking place in a part of the world that is much closer geographically to Russia. This means that logistical support for the Russian military will be more readily available than for any NATO military. And it also means that Russian military equipment is designed from the ground up to fight in climates such as the climates that we see in Western Ukraine. NATO vehicles, NATO tanks, infantry fighting vehicles, armored personnel carriers, all weigh anywhere between 20 to 50% more than that of their Russian counterparts. This excess weight is going to prove very taxing on the sparse infrastructure that is available in this part of the world. Not to mention the fact that mud is going to prove a huge issue to 72-ton tanks that are trying to traverse these areas during Rasputitsa. Although I should mention that the extent and magnitude of these factors depends on exactly which region of Ukraine one is talking about. In the westernmost regions of Ukraine, this ability to project power is a lot greater than in central Ukraine. But of course, the far bigger danger than a conventional armed conflict is a nuclear armed conflict. So to put it simply, if NATO really does decide to go through with this land grab in western Ukraine, and if this land grab is not just some tiny sliver of land, if it actually decides to take a significant chunk of Ukrainian territory, then the chance of some provocation, which leads to an armed clash, which inevitably leads to some kind of nuclear exchange, becomes very high. In fact, it becomes higher than it's ever been in the history of the planet. I dare say that if NATO does decide to move troops into western Ukraine, the nuclear threat would be higher than that of the Cuban Missile Crisis. And I don't think that I need to explain to anybody what that would entail. This is why I sincerely hope that my predictions about a joint NATO intervention into Ukraine are wrong. So here's to hoping that I'm not going to be making any more videos on this particular subject. With that said, I hope that you enjoyed this video. Please let me know as to your thoughts on this matter. Please let me know in the comments. And also, if you haven't already, please check out my other channels on Rumble and on Telegram. Both of these are amazing platforms which have no political censorship whatsoever, and especially on Telegram, I am able to write quick posts and to give small updates, which I am not able to do on YouTube. Also, I should mention that Telegram is probably the best platform to find live information on the Ukraine war. There are lots of channels on Telegram giving regular updates as to the situation on the ground, and I should emphasize that my channel isn't one of them. Unfortunately, I don't have time to run a 24/7 Telegram channel and to give out regular updates, and it won't be difficult to find other channels which indeed do this. And sometimes you can find these other channels from my channel as well, whenever I forward some message from one of these channels. Anyways, with this said, I thank you all for listening to my video, and I hope that you enjoyed it.